I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous owners of the land on which I am. The Wiradjuri people, and recognise their unique contribution to our environmental and cultural heritage, past, present and future. And I extend our respect to all Indigenous people online or present this lunchtime. So welcome everybody to our first New South Wales Royal Society panel conversation on the topic Public Trust and Science in Times of Coronavirus. My name's Mark Evans, and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for the Research here at Charles Sturt University, and I'm delighted to host today's panel. Now, let me begin by putting today's discussion in context. Public trust is critically important for pandemic recovery, because without it, the confidence necessary to build an effective and sustained recovery is in peril. People need to trust the government to support more government intervention that makes a difference. In mid-2020, Australia was widely viewed by the public as having successfully managed the pandemic, especially when compared to the US, the UK, and other European countries. Trust in people in government almost doubled in a year from 29% to 54%. But the same is not the case today. My latest research with the Social Research Institute at Ipsos, conducted in November 2021, shows that public trust declined 12 points from 54% to 42% in a matter of months during the back end of last year. And there's new polls actually out over the last few days that now shows that Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, is at the lowest level of trust recorded in recent times. So institutions deemed rightly or wrongly to be acting on the basis of self-interest or against the collective interest fared worse. And unfortunately, politicians figure very strongly. There is evidence of receding trust in political parties, now standing at 20%. The National Cabinet, from a previous high of 58%, is now at 38%. And other key institutions perceived as bringing politics into disrepute, such as television, the press, and especially social media, have very low levels of trust. Now, in contrast, institutions viewed as extending the protective powers of democracy in a time of fear, safeguarding our civic culture and heritage, community security, health and well-being are most trusted. So, for example, note the high levels of trust in defence and law and order organisations. Moreover, the highest level of trust are bestowed to Medicare, cultural institutions such as libraries and museums, and universities and scientific experts. So, and this is obviously what is of particular significance to our discussions, Australian citizens trust scientists. And this was the case even before the pandemic. The Wellcome Global Monitor ran a survey in 2019 on trust in science in over 140 countries, which also included a question on trust in national government. And Australia ranked 85th out of 134 countries for its level of political trust, but 14th out of 144 for trust in science. So in short, COVID-19 has brought to centre stage the role of the expert and science in the policy response to what has been the most serious international health crisis in a century. And given the trusted position on the front line of public education that universities hold and scientists hold, it's timely to evaluate the role that scientific experts and more generally universities can and do play in enhancing democratic governance and bridging the trust divide between government and the people. So to help us with this puzzle, we have a fantastic panel of experts. First of all, I'd like to introduce to you Professor Robert Clancy, AM. Robert's a retired clinical immunologist in the field of postgosal immunology. Robert is known for his research and development of therapies for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, commonly known as emphysema. He is also chair of the advisory board to Charles Sturt's Regional and Rural Health Institute, which is shortly to launch. Welcome, Robert. And then we're joined by Michelle Grattan. Now, as you're all aware, Michelle is one of Australia's most revered political journalists. She's written and edited for many significant Australian newspapers, has written a whole range of fascinating books on different aspects of Australian politics. And she's currently the chief correspondent with The Conversation. And as you're all aware, The Conversation is now, it's been an incredible success story, is the largest independent news website now in Australia. She's also Professorial Fellow at the University of Canberra. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks, Mark.
And then here at the Grange at Charles Sturt University, I'm delighted to introduce you to Professor Jane Quinn. And Jane's an expert in developmental genetics here at Charles Sturt University. She was awarded a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and her research focuses on strategies to improve livestock productivity and economic outcomes for the Australian farming sector. She deploys innovative field and molecular technology-based approaches, and particularly novel pharmaceuticals or management practices for the animal health industry, several of which have been awarded patent protection. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Mark.
So I'm going to begin by asking Michelle some key questions really around the politics of science and trust. So Michelle, first of all, why do you think Australians are presently struggling with trusting their politicians and political institutions?
Mark, I think this is part of a longer term trend, which we've seen in Western democracies since the 70s. We've seen particularly, and your research has gone to the core of this since the mid-90s, a declining level of faith in political leaders and political institutions. Now, in a way, I think we can see the pandemic as being an interruption to that trend. In a time of total uncertainty, people went back to the more traditional institutions. Now, this is leaving aside the question of experts, who, of course, have been more trusted than the political class in general, all through. But in terms of institutions, when they were so uncertain, they went back to putting faith in the political leaders, in the institutions. And we saw, of course, the leaders out every day during the pandemic reporting what was being done and advice to people, orders indeed to the general public. So the leaders, federal and state in Australia, were very visible. Now that the pandemic has receded, that we're into this phase of living with COVID, I think that the normal pattern of low trust in political leaders and the political class generally, and institutions directly involved in politics, that pattern has reasserted itself.
So we're returning to a historical continuity. So look, what has the pandemic told us about the role of science and experts in Australia and politicians' attitudes towards them?
I think this has been a very interesting story, and for the experts, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, sometimes welcome, sometimes unwelcome participation in the hurly-burly of politics in the real world of politics. What we saw initially was, in that very uncertain period when the politicians, the political leaders didn't really have any personal grip on the situation, the knowledge of COVID. They lent on the experts, they sought their advice, they took their advice, they paraded them publicly, that is at least the governmental experts. So we used to see Brendan Murphy, who was the Chief Medical Officer for the Commonwealth, out with the Prime Minister at his news conferences, and other Commonwealth experts as well. Now, of course, in the world of expertise, there was already some debate about the nature of COVID and how you dealt with it. But the dominant story was that governments were looking to the experts and were playing up the fact they were taking their advice. Then later we moved into another stage where the experts found themselves increasingly drawn into the politics. So in sections of the media, for example, on Sky Television, you often heard the experts attacked in conjunction with attacks, for example, on premiers. So Brett Sutton, the Chief Medical Officer in Victoria, became quite a controversial figure, quite a target. Indeed, he's an interesting story in himself because he became a cult figure among those who admired him and followed him, to an extraordinary degree, even having merchandise named after him, and yet a boo figure for critics. So that happened to a lesser extent for many experts. They did get caught up in the politics. Now I think we're in another stage where essentially the politicians, the political leaders have reasserted their own voice. They're not leaning on the experts so much, pardon me, and in many cases, some cases at least, they're diverging from the experts. So, for example, in New South Wales, we get reports of the health people wanting to be far more cautious than the politicians. And I heard Brad Hazzard the other day, the health minister, say that even if there's another wave of COVID, another variant, this subvariant, which is expected to surge, that there wouldn't be restrictions imposed. His argument was, we're over it. Enough is enough. And so the politicians have become less risk averse in terms of the medical situation, and more saying the economy's got to get back to normal, businesses have got to be protected and helped, and the general public's had enough. So the whole story of the experts has been one where they've moved through several phases. They've come into their own, they've become more controversial, and then they've been a bit, not entirely of course, but a bit pushed to the side again.
There's been some allegations as well, haven't there, that certain scientists have been kind of uniquely privileged in this process. Allegations of the Melbourne mafia, for example, as they've been characterised, having a big structural influence around the Department of Health. Is there much truth in that?
Look, it's hard to be precise about this, but clearly, yes, some have been closer to the sun than others. As I say, some have become controversial figures in the politics, sort of in their own right. I think that probably there've been networks who has known who from within the field of expertise, and that means that some can get drawn in more closely, and then you have big institutions like the Doherty Institute, which has done crucial modelling, which has been central to National Cabinet's response. And sometimes you get some experts arguing with others over particular issues. So, yes, it's not an equal world by any means.
Thank you, Michelle. Robert, there's been a great deal of contestation in the science community over the COVID science. Which scientists were able to break through the media noise, and why? And do you think that some experts have become politicized during COVID-19?
Thanks, Mark. And thank you very much for the opportunity of being on this extraordinary panel on a very, very important topic. And I don't often get a chance to say, Michelle, that you've been an icon and heroine of mine for many, many years. And I'm pleased to say that what I'm going to be saying is very similar to what you're saying, but from very much a biomedical and clinical viewpoint. Last week, Rochelle Walensky, who is the director of the CDC in Washington in America, had a very, very interesting interview. She said, looking back at the early times, so many of us wanted to be hopeful. This is our ticket out. Now we are done. And she went on to say that she actually heard the results of the initial FISA trials. And remember, this is the director of the leading institute in America, through CNN, watching CNN. And she said, looking back, I think we had too much optimism and not enough caution. There was not sufficient transparency between the pharma groups and her institutions. And as she looked back, she said, you know, the science has been grey, not black and white. And I thought that was a very, very accurate summary of where things are at, because as a result of those very early times, as the pharma studies became out, and they looked pretty good, and they were pretty good, 90% protection, which surprised me and surprised a lot of us, because COVID is not a systemic infection in the same way measles or polio is. And it's much more like influenza. And we don't have time to go into the details of this, but as a result of this great enthusiasm, which I think Rochelle Walensky encapsulated, we developed a narrative driven by the pharma company, very quickly picked up by politicians, and very much transmitted and promoted through much of the press, and very quickly picked up by the experts who were part of the process. Now, the experts were mainly epidemiologists, infectious disease physicians, very, very good at what they do. Epidemiology became a growth industry. There were quite a few people I've worked with and who are friends of mine who I'd always known as something else, but they were suddenly epidemiologists. So everyone was an epidemiologist. We had a narrative and the narrative was about the vaccine's going to be our ticket to get out of all of this. Everything had to protect the narrative. And as a result of that, there was suppression of anything that would possibly compromise the vaccine. And again, we don't have time to go into all those details, but there was a suppression right across the board of early treatments, things like this. Now, a couple of my friends and colleagues who've been involved in mucosal immunology really from the halcyon days of the 60s and 70s shot a warning shot, saying, well, wait a second, this is a disease of the airways, not a disease of the blood system. And you've got a different sort of immunity that's involved. But that sort of got lost. And a few people started looking at what was going on in the airways, not many, but a couple. And what they found was sort of unexpected. And I can remember reading these, and one person said, well, the textbooks aren't telling us what's going on here. And someone else said, we were very surprised. Now, around this time, we started finding that the vaccines really weren't working in the same way as measles vaccines. After 6 months, we started finding breakthrough infections, and more so as we went on with time, we actually got a reverse, that people who were vaccinated were getting more infections. They still had reasonable protection against severe infection, which of course is what we're really looking at. But there was clearly a dynamic here that didn't make a lot of sense. Now, what I'm really saying here is that, as Michelle indicated, there were phases, and this phase of narrative is sort of wearing out now as the reality that vaccines have an incredibly important role and will continue to do so. But we're running into issues and problems where the science is starting to provide a focus. And the particular one is that if we keep giving boosters, as some people would like to do, we're actually turning off the immune response and getting more infections. And this is perfectly understandable if you, as everyone here would know about, say, desensitization for allergies. You give people injection after injection and they turn off their immunity. And this comes back way back to the ideas of oral tolerance and food hypersensitivity, areas which are very different to the experts who are giving the advice on vaccinology. And so my view is that what has actually happened is that we've had a narrative based on an initial enthusiasm, which has been extremely good. We've had protection against dying and going into hospital, but now we're moving into a very different phase. And this phase is a phase where I believe science will start emerging, a different form of science, science which says we're in a position of change. We have to look at how differently we can do things. How do we rearrange our vaccine program so we don't end up getting more infections rather than less infections? How we don't end up getting an inability to use COVID vaccines for seasonal disease as we move into that phase.
And clearly there's a social science dynamic to that as well, isn't there now? I mean, you could argue basically that the next phase could be the phase of the social scientist rather than the medical scientist.
Mark, you're my sort of boss, so I've got to be careful what I say. Mark, you're absolutely right, because I think that we need the social scientist to help us translate the science which is starting to emerge. I'm not saying the science was terribly wrong early on, but it reflected on an aspect that was important, but it's all changed. And I think that that's going to require social science to provide an educational frame that allows us to accept that science has an incredibly important role and will have a role. And maybe we can develop that theme with some of the later on in this session.
I mean, it's interesting that the news from the UK basically is that Boris Johnson was basically slow to close down the borders in the UK because the Behavioural Insights Unit told him that it would make no difference because of low levels of trust with British citizens, and the British citizens wouldn't exhibit the behaviours necessary to make it work effectively. So it's interesting that the social scientists did have a go at the beginning.
I've recently written a book on the history of science in Australia, and I was overwhelmed by how Australians are much more attuned to science. We've used science to become the country we are. And but I think that, so Australians have always been connected to science in a way more so than I think in many of the European countries.
Absolutely. And I mean, the evidence tells us, for example, that there's a huge literature around populism and the way in which increasingly citizens that view themselves as being left behind by the hard edges of, impacted by the hard edges of globalization, are very much anti-expert. And obviously this fueled the rising support for Trump, but also the rising support of right and left-wing populisms across Europe. Jane, let me bring you in now. This is a bit of an ambitious question, but can you get away with poor political leadership if you've got strong science leadership?
That is a really difficult question, Mark, because I don't know how we would test that theory without falling over some very significant philosophical hurdles. So I think one of the things that we've all been inherently aware of as COVID-19 has emerged globally is that we're all part essentially of a living experiment. And those of us who've been following the scientific discovery around this, and we're hearing about, how some of those have rolled out, have seen how that process has both fostered safety and security in our societies, which in some cases has been led by our politicians, but in some cases has been fundamentally led by the scientific advice they're receiving. And then in other cases where we've actually seen the scientific community to some extent undermine their own credibility, we're particularly thinking of some of the early papers that came out on some what were reported as being breakthrough studies on the use of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, which were actually fundamentally flawed and breached some integrity rules, yet had been published in some extremely high-profile journals. The scientific community then had to rally against themselves to, highlight how the lack of integrity in some of the data had actually undermined the outcomes of those studies. And in the case of hydroxychloroquine, that meant pulling that from a whole arm of a major worldwide WHO study. So I think that there is a tension between what the expectations are around scientific endeavour, the processes that we need to undertake for that to be a really scrupulous process with a high level of integrity, and the instant response that often government requires. So I think that we've had some level of cognitive dissonance in the way that we've seen politics and science intersect throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, where often science has been trying to say, hang on, we need to slow down and actually really nut down on some of the results that we're finding. And politics has been saying, no, speed up. And we've ended up with I think the population falling in the middle. And this is where we've often seen people reverting to, what's been the biggest, most high profile campaigns on social media, rather than looking to the experts or looking to their politicians to see where the truth really lies. I think that's been a really fundamental challenge over the last 2 years.
Beautifully put. So look, thinking about that then, because there is a sense of try, test and learn around the whole process. How important is transparency in enabling open debate and testing of scientific advice?
Well, I think it's critical. So we've seen some, I think, interesting and useful advances in that, particularly with things like the advent of open pre-peer review publication through RivArchive. That has enabled very fast track visibility of scientific data and results. The downside of that is it also then presents data and results that have not been through a rigorous peer review. And so you have to then look at that information with a hefty level of skepticism. And I think one of the things that's really become very apparent during the COVID crisis has been that people want certainty. And unfortunately, science is a process that doesn't necessarily give certainty, in that discovery is always new information on what was our previous dogma as being the truth. So when we think about this holistically and look at the way that that information is then used to support campaigns around use of treatments or processes, and we've seen this tension occurring all the way through the pandemic, with the epidemiological advice counted against what was the best economic situation for our states and on our country. And that globally has, been played out in a very grand scale elsewhere. I think that's presented us with some very significant challenges.
Yeah, and at the same time, our geographical location has helped us, hasn't it? We have been more of a spectator in terms of COVID-19, because obviously there's a lot of countries. I mean, as you probably know, my family is from the UK, and there's not a member of my family or my extended family that haven't had COVID-19. And where my dad lives, for example, in Clitheroe, literally within 10-mile radius of where he lives, 40,000 people have died. So there is that sense as well that the immediacy that people in the UK and the US have felt has driven a more, what would I say, almost like a moral panic around the crisis. And we've not had that same issue here, I don't think.
No, we haven't. We've been extremely fortunate, and my family are from the UK as well, and I can countenance to what you say. I think, however, what we have observed happening in those countries is where some of the early scientific discovery that was highlighting particular treatments and therapies that then were proven to be less than effective after more rigorous scientific experiments had been undertaken and larger scale trials had shown was taken up with a level of alarming uptake to the extent that it was actually detrimental to some of those populations. So I think this is where that balance has become so critical. And I also think one of the things that we've, I think, been fundamentally aware of in Australia, which perhaps isn't so much the case in other countries, because we've had that advantage of being able to foresight what has happened in other places, is that our government has very much come into the fore with we're working on the basis of a worst case scenario visible elsewhere, and we're going to protect you from it by going to the furthest extreme that we can. And and if you think of the kind of political philosophy of Helen Arendt in the last century, where was really looking at some very extreme examples of political control. How far have we had our government ask for forgiveness before asking for acceptance, I guess?
Yeah, that's a fascinating observation. I mean, look, I think we could claim to say that we have had a caring approach to COVID-19 that's not been exhibited in other countries. Lives have mattered here, which is an interesting reflection. Coming back to Robert, what do you think will be the long-term legacy of the greater use of and regard for experts in the pandemic? Do you think this will translate to other areas? Or is health an exceptional one-off area where politics doesn't come into play as much, in contrast, for example, with climate change?
Right. Look, just before I do, sorry, Jane, I'm going to have to totally disagree with you on the ivermectin hydroxychloroquine. That's been the most suppressed story, and ultimately the science, which is very, very solid, with literally hundreds of studies. And we're not going to go into it now, but I don't think people should go away thinking that that has been anything but a casualty of the suppression to protect vaccines, but that's another story. Look, to answer your question, Mark, I am very optimistic. I'm interested in the history of pandemics and epidemics, and I look back, say, over the last 120 years in Australia, and we've had, this is the third of the great pandemics that have affected us. We've had little nudges along the way. If you go back to the plague in 1900, the same level of confusion and political and press and other issues dominated the scene for the first couple of years. And there was one man called Ashburton Thompson. And Ashburton Thompson was the person who came up with the idea of test and trace and isolate, but he was isolating rats, not humans. And that changed the whole outcome of the plague pandemic in Australia. But it took a couple of years. And the big advantage that he had was his brother was a senior reporter for the Sydney Morning Herald. And he promoted and supported at a time when the rest of the press was lining up with the various governments and basically shunting everybody into quarantine stations, which of course made no difference. It just gave more people the plague. So I think there's that tradition. And I mentioned the Australian tradition of science. The second great pandemic was with influenza. And out of that came Burnett. And Burnett reshaped and refashioned the way people looked at influenza. He was critical in putting together the structure of the virus. He did the groundwork for growing the virus in eggs. He did an enormous amount in establishing the opportunity for vaccination. So Australia has had some amazing people. And I think what we're looking for here is an amazing person, although the complexity of science and disease has changed so much that my personal view is that it'll be an institute that will evolve. And maybe we can discuss some of that later.
Thank you, Robert. Now, as you know, we have a chat box. I'm going to open up shortly to questions from from participants. And it would be useful if you could put those questions in the chat box so I make sure that I get through all the questions. And you'll have a little bit of time to do this because I'm now going to ask Michelle a political question. Given that we're close to an election, and our topic is trust, public trust, what role, Michelle, do you think public trust will play in the forthcoming election?
Well, you mentioned the news poll today, which reports the low level of trust in the Prime Minister. We have to put this, of course, in the overall issue of trust that we spoke about earlier. But I do think that one of the problems that the Prime Minister has in this election is that he has become much less trusted, and his character has come under quite a lot of criticism, negative scrutiny, and of course he's been accused of lying both by the opposition but also by some others, famously the French president. So I do think that trust generally, and particularly trust of the Prime Minister, will be a factor in this election, but it'll only be one of a number of factors. And I think also you've got to distinguish, when you get down to this sort of political context, between different sorts of trust. And I go back to John Howard in 2004, and there was some evidence shortly before that election about the role of the government in children overboard, fresh evidence. That issue, of course, had been in the previous election. And even though that evidence threw a lot of doubt on Howard and suggested he was untrustworthy, he actually ran and launched the election on the theme of who do you trust? So in other words, you can have a political leader who has been strongly questioned, his trustworthiness has been strongly questioned, but when you look at issues more generally, or a government more generally, people can put that aside and say, well, this government is potentially a better bet when it comes to trust on the economy or trust on national security or whatever. So I'm not saying this in a predictive sense. I'm just saying that the question of trust in an electoral contest is a more complicated and layered one than it might appear at first blush.
So does that explain why, for example, Anthony Albanese has been quite low-key in attacking Scott Morrison on that topic? He mentioned it in the 60 Minutes interview a couple of days ago, but Labour hasn't been really on the front foot on these issues. Can we expect more activism around that issue going forward, or do you think they're still going to play a let's wait and see game and let's not do anything that upsets the apple cart?
I think certainly they had a big go at Scott Morrison on character questions when there were a few lines of attack and issues that emerged. I think they were quite strong on it. I would expect it to come up in their political advertising in the election. Just at the moment, I think that they're sort of stepping back a bit and letting the other negative issues that are running against the Prime Minister get more attention. So they don't want to divert the conversation. If the conversation generally is critical of the Prime Minister, then the opposition doesn't want to get in the way of that conversation.
Thank you, Michelle. So let's now turn back to the question of the role that science can play in bridging the trust divide between the government and the citizen. I'm going to ask Jane that question, but Frank Marino has just asked kind of an overlapping question as well. So Jane, maybe you can think about both of them. His question is, what difference does it make who says what if the general public do not understand the fundamental concepts of how science works? For instance, the basic premise of falsification. Do we have faith that the public understands this? So I guess Frank's suggesting that that is a role that science should be playing more effectively, the civics education dimension to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, I think, speaks to one of the themes of this talk today, which is, what role can the higher education sector play in establishing that trust and faith in science? I think, as I said earlier, I think we've seen some good science and some bad science throughout COVID, and we have certainly seen the importance of the integrity of science and the trust and faith in evidence brought to a very high bar. And I think that's where that high bar should sit. I think in some ways we have possibly allowed ourselves to take a focus off integrity, and particularly, publishing integrity, research integrity, which has become so fundamental in the arguments made for many of the approaches taken during the pandemic. So I think absolutely, this is something that we need to teach in schools. We need to teach at a higher level in universities as well, to make it a core tenet of the courses that we deliver, that the integrity of our approach and our ability to communicate that effectively become part of the training that we give to scientists right from their earliest days, emerging in the schools and in the universities.
So really, we have a fundamental role to play in addressing problems of truth decay and sense making around the noise where we claim to have research excellence. Because it's not just obviously in this area, there's other areas basically that are being dominated by conspiracy theories. And universities, you could argue, have a public responsibility to address those issues where they have strong claims to research excellence. Jennifer Podesta asked the question, I am interested in the extent to which the public applied their own assessment of the science to make decisions about vaccinations, e.g. the significance of the number of cases of blood clots in relation to AZ. I'm interested in the extent to which the public applied their own assessment of science to make. So are you suggesting, Jennifer, that citizens have been more deliberative in their approach to decision-making in those types of areas, or have they engaged too much in fast decision-making?
I'm wondering if this isn't a little bit of a question around framing.
Right. So,
the context of framing of risk in relation to health matters, and Robert may well have a particular way of speaking to this. When we think about the risk in terms of population numbers compared to the risk to the individual, I'm not sure that was framed well at the start. And I think this is an example of where science communication becomes so important in trying to make sure that the framing of a topic or the framing of the facts that are put in front of the public actually allows them to have the best opportunity to take advantage of that information. I'm not sure that we did that very well.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually when you look at the data, the movement away from the government emerged as a consequence of public dismay at the slowness of the vaccine rollout. And then, of course, they brought in the army and they developed the task force and the whole government communication completely transformed in a very short period of time. And actually was pretty successful in terms of the strategy that they adopted. So clearly they were definitely thinking about the election on the horizon there. Robert, do you want to come in?
I think Jane is absolutely right. It really does get down to communication. Every day I'll have phone calls, emails. I don't know how people get my email or my phone number, but I'll get 2 or 3 a day with exactly this type of frustration. I find the people contacting me are highly intelligent. They understand, but they're confused. And I think part of the problem is that there has been a suppression, a widespread suppression of anything that doesn't suit that early narrative. And I would like to think we're moving out of that period. The press, for example, would never, ever accept an article from someone like myself because I might ask questions that don't fit the narrative. And I think that people are picking up now that they're seeing that there are more side effects than they had been told early on of a totally safe genetic vaccines. We're picking up that the vaccines only last, for example, the boosters are only lasting for 2 months to prevent infection, still preventing serious disease. So there are chinks in the armour, and it is a very important time for scientists now to get our act together and transmit as widely as we possibly can. But we must have the press on side. We must have the various organisations on side, because I think there's a gap between a lot of the scientists who do understand the process and a lot of the organisations acting at a public level. And the public are picking this up and they're asking questions themselves.
Michelle, do you remember the work that we did a couple of years during the first year of COVID-19? We were picking up on Robert's point there. We were finding that happening a little bit, weren't we? There were attempts to suppress counter narratives to the government line at that time.
Well, yes, and of course the scientists themselves differed and still differ in terms of various aspects and emphases. And I guess this is really just inevitable. To the point about people reacting about whether to be vaccinated or not, you will always get, I think, in an uncertain situation, dramatisation by the media. And I remember, of course, that evening press conference by the Prime Minister after he got the advice about the side effects of AstraZeneca and the changes that were recommended in terms of age groups. Of course, that came out dramatically in the media, and it was fairly dramatic, frankly, even at that press conference. But then, as time goes on, things settle down. So people read and hear about problems and risks and so on, and that dominates their attention. And then in a few weeks, it started to settle and people put the risks more into perspective. Of course, when you're trying to roll out a vaccination program quickly, then that sort of interruption is a quite big setback and very annoying for those who are trying to get the job done. But in a dynamic situation where advice is changing and things are emerging, new facts are emerging about the vaccines, it's hard really to avoid that sort of up and down drama.
Thank you, Michelle. We have a question from Seamus Miller to everybody. If vaccines are not a silver bullet because they turn off immunity, and therapeutics are also only part of the solution to what seems to be an ongoing COVID problem, what are the other necessary elements in the solution? Ongoing targeted measures such as mask wearing, self-isolation, etc. And he questions. Jane, have you got a response to that?
Well, I think this is a question in everybody's minds. You know, how much has our world changed, and will it continue to remain changed in response to COVID-19? I mean, certainly we've seen other measures in addition to treatments of vaccination being very successful in controlling spread of virus locally and nationally. And the question is, where does this leave us with in terms of personal responsibility in our own lives to control what we know is a highly contagious disease? I'm not sure I have an overwhelmingly correct answer to that. I think it's back to that position of personal responsibility, and I think whilst there can be mandated controls, at the end of the day, we make personal choices, and that's probably what this has shown us much more than any other experience in my lifetime. That's for sure.
Yeah, I guess that's where we've landed in the recovery cycle at the moment. The emphasis on personal responsibility. Jeff Gurr asks Michelle.
Can I just comment on that question though, very quickly?
Okay.
Because I do have some views. I think we're at a very, very interesting watershed area. Vaccines have been, are, and will be a very important basis for our ongoing management. This disease is not going to disappear. It's probably going to settle down like influenza. Even now, the mortality rate from COVID is less than the mortality rate for influenza in 2019, which I think we need to keep in perspective. It's more infectious and it's in our minds, and of course it's a dominant factor. The big issue with the vaccine is that it's like the flu vaccine, and the more and more we look at it, the closer it's going to get. And what we need to do is work out spacing. At the moment, we're saying, let's boost. And the more we boost, the more it's up and down because of the suppression mechanisms involved, which are well understood. And so my view is that the logic, science-based way to go forward is to provide, as they've done in Brazil and various other countries, home packages of quite effective treatment, which is very simple, together with a program to sort out the optimal spacing, because if we do not do that, we're going to deny ourselves the opportunity of long-term vaccination on a seasonal basis, because we all know that when you turn off this immune response, as we do with desensitization to ryegrass and pollens in the air, it lasts 5 years. And a lot of scientists around the world are getting very concerned about this. I don't think they really always understand the mechanism, but it is an issue.
Well, thank you, Robert. So Jeff Gurr wanted to ask Michelle, to what extent does public trust in government become eroded over a particular issue versus a cumulative effect from successive issues? I wonder if current levels of mistrust in the Morrison government are not just from recent failures in vaccine rollout, hotel quarantine, etc., but rest on early erosion of trust from sports rorts, car park rorts, etc. Michelle.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that both things are true. I think that there is this general mistrust of political leaders, of the political class, and that's a very widespread thing, and it's worse in some democracies than others. It comes and goes a bit, but we've talked about the trend. I think that in terms of this government, probably issues like scandals, the feeling that politicians are behaving badly, their general behaviour often feeds into this, the sort of way they treat each other, but the feeling that they misuse public money for their political gain, like in sports rorts and other things, that's very corrosive of trust. I think that the decline in trust that comes from things like faults in the rollout and so on is rather different and is more in the line of a general going back to normal feelings. It's people thinking at one stage, yes, the politicians have the answers, or the government has the answers, and it's the only institution, as it were, that we're looking to make the decisions in this situation. That lasts for a while, and then you see, well, how they've acted is not perfect, and so on, and so there's a reversion to the previous situation. But when they see things like scandals, misuse of public money, deliberate misuse of public money, then that is a particular black mark, I think, because it goes to political character more generally of individuals, but also of a government.
So it's almost become embedded in the political culture now. There's almost an expectation that politicians engage in bad behaviour.
Yes, there is, but I think that the fact that people believe that and are very cynical about politicians doesn't stop them being very censorious of it as well. And that is a very corrosive thing overall.
An important question from David Nash. Further on this, could the panel comment on the status of the speciality of science journalism within journalism and how to foster it? Michelle, is this a dying art? Is scientific journalism a dying art?
Look, I think this goes to the general issue of specialists in the media these days. And the media, or the legacy media's business model, of course, collapsed for economic reasons, for the migration of advertising to digital platforms. And that's a whole big story. But that meant that there are fewer journalists, and the journalists that have been casualties really have been specialists. Either specialists have gone or the people recruited are not specialists. Combine this with the very fast media cycle and journalists having to file much more than they used to, and you do get a decline in science journalism. I'm talking here about the general media, not the particular science journals and so on, but in the general media. But you also get a decline in detailed reporting of the education sector or defence or foreign affairs. So it's a general problem, it's a real problem, and there's no quick answer to this in the current media landscape, where the emphasis is on speed and clickbaits, and really it's often pretty superficial.
Jane or Robert, do you want to come in there? On the issue of scientific journalism?
I think what Michelle has said is absolutely right. It's I've noticed that a lot of the people who are journalists are becoming more commentators than journalism, rather than reporting ideas in a balanced way. They'll hoe in with their opinion. I mean, one example, I wrote to a young lady who wrote a horrific article about ivermectin. Now, ivermectin's controversial, but the database supporting it is huge. It's huge. And it's not just randomized controlled trials, it's many other areas. She wrote a terrible article, and I wrote a nice letter to her and said, look, why didn't you put a more balanced view? And she actually wrote back to me, which was surprising. And she wrote a nice letter and she said, look, we only talk about randomized controlled trials. If you've got a randomized controlled trial, well, we'll report it. So I wrote back and said, well, here you are. Here's 32 randomized controlled trials, 31 of which show that ivermectin works. I never heard another word. So I think it's very complicated. I think there's huge pressure on these kids. They're often very young. I think the other thing she did was court reporting and something else. So you're asked, as Michelle said, they're being asked to do a lot of things that cover a lot of different areas. But it would be nice if they could be more journalist than a commentator when they really don't know very much about the topic.
So let me ask a final question to each member of the panel, because we're running out of of time now. So this is in the frame of what universities should be doing to address this issue. So could each panelist give us one example of what universities should be doing to address this problem of declining trust? I'll start with Jane.
Thanks, Mark. Look, I think we have a fundamental role to play in educating the next generation of scientists, of journalists, of doctors, of politicians in how to interrogate information and how to assess its integrity. I think that's a core component of what we need to embed in our courses moving forward. And clearly we can focus on areas like scientific journalism, which I don't think do have specialist courses related to them anywhere. Also, we know we've seen a denigration of the arts more broadly across the sector, and we've seen, political intervention and vetoes of ARC funding, and the stability of the whole infrastructure of the relationship between science and the government destabilising. And I think that's because, as Michelle was saying, essentially scientific journalism is and politicians are the bastion of the specialist generalist, and they actually need the specialists to sit alongside them. I think that's definitely our role.
Thank you, Jane. Some great insights there. Robert.
Well, thanks for the question, Mark. My view is this, that the complexities of these big issues that are affecting the world are very, very hard for universities. Australian universities are under enormous stresses and pressure. And what I've noticed is that they're either not getting involved, or they're getting involved in areas they don't understand. And my personal view is that what Charles Sturt is doing, and I'm actually involved with Charles Sturt because I'm so excited about the approach they're taking. They're saying, let's develop institutes which can really take a substantial issue and look at it, communicate, become the transit zone for the university, so that people within the university with particular expertises can be part of the bigger whole, that they can communicate with the public where they identify the issues. The one I'm involved with, of course, is a health institute, and I'm incredibly excited about the way in which we can have a new light on big problems and bring in people from the universities. So my view is that I think the universities as they currently exist have a lot of issues, a lot of problems with everything from free speech to politically correct ideas. And I don't think that that's going to work too well in the future. I think it's going to work through collective focused areas like institutes. And I'll give you a plug, Mark. I really think what you're doing with developing 3 research institutes is so exciting and the way to go, and the way to address these issues in the future.
Thank you, Robert. And then a final word with Michelle.
Well, of course, it's a very big question and a very difficult one for universities to grapple with. But I think that it's very important that universities have great rigour in their education, in their teaching, in their courses. I think it's also important that their values include encouraging tolerance and pluralism, tolerance of a wide range of views. And also, I think, and this is probably not just universities, but schools too, start to emphasise more democratic values, the importance of our democracy, how our democracy works. And so people who emerge from schools and are at universities do have a notion of our general political system, its values and its structure and its importance.
Thank you, Michelle. So there we have a clarion call from our 3 panelists for greater research rigour, for ensuring that we catalyse a plurality of ideas, and the importance that universities play in supporting lifelong learning in civics education, not just amongst our students, but within the communities that we serve as well. So look, it just remains for me to thank our fantastic panel for sharing their ideas with us this lunchtime. And I hope everybody's enjoyed this lunchtime discussion as much as I have. So thank you so much to the three of you for your contribution to this session. And of course, to you, the audience, for participating so effectively as well. Thank you for your patience over the technology.